Some bonds run deeper than words can express, and few understand this better than those who dedicate their lives to caring for the animals we love. After 50 years as a veterinarian, Dr. Martin Caldwell thought he had seen everything. But one evening call would test every ounce of wisdom and compassion he had gathered over a lifetime. The Henderson family had owned Belle, their gentle mare, for 28 years. 3 generations had learned to ride on her back, shared their secrets with her, and found comfort in her steady presence through life's ups and downs. When they noticed a small lump on Belle's neck, it seemed harmless enough. But when Martin examined the growth that summer evening, what he felt beneath his experienced hands made his heart sink. The discovery would force both the veterinarian and the family to face one of life's most difficult truths about letting go of those we cherish most. What could be so devastating about a simple lump that it would shake a seasoned vet to his core? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window of Dr. Martin Caldwell's farmhouse, casting long shadows across the worn oak table where he sat with his coffee and the local newspaper. At 70, his hands showed the wear of 5 decades, spent healing animals, calloused from countless barn calls, scarred from the occasional kick or bite, yet still steady enough to thread the finest suture. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 7 times, marking another day in what he'd begun to think of as his twilight years. Martin's eyes wandered to the antique leather veterinary bag sitting on the kitchen counter. His grandfather's bag, passed down through 3 generations of Caldwell veterinarians. The leather had darkened with age and use, its brass clasps worn smooth by countless openings. Inside, it still held some of the original instruments his grandfather had used in the 1920s, alongside Martin's own modern tools. That bag represented more than medical equipment. It was a legacy of service, of answering calls at all hours, of being the bridge between life and death for creatures who couldn't speak their pain. He'd been thinking more about legacy lately, especially since his wife Eleanor's passing 3 years ago. Their son David lived in Seattle now, a successful software engineer who sent dutiful birthday cards and called every few weeks. They'd grown apart after David chose computers over animals, a choice Martin had never quite understood but learned to accept. The phone calls had become shorter over the years, filled with polite updates about work and weather rather than the easy conversations they'd once shared. The sound of gravel crunching in the driveway interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he watched Tom Henderson's familiar pickup truck pull up to the clinic entrance. Tom had been bringing his animals to Martin for 37 years, ever since he'd taken over his father's farm. The man climbing out of the truck moved with the careful deliberation of someone who'd spent 7 decades working the land. Shoulders slightly stooped from years of hay bales and fence posts, but still strong enough to handle 1,000-pound horse. Martin smiled as he remembered Tom's first visit all those years ago, a nervous young farmer with a prize heifer having complications during calving. Tom had stood in the corner of the barn, wringing his hat in his hands while Martin worked. Now that same farmer was one of the most respected ranchers in 3 counties, and his daughter Sarah had taken over most of the day-to-day operations. Sarah Henderson Walsh was everything her father was, and more. A sharp businesswoman who'd modernized the farm while maintaining its traditional values. At 45, she balanced running the operation with raising her own 2 teenagers, Jake and Emma. Her husband had passed away from cancer 5 years earlier, leaving her to manage both grief and responsibility with the kind of quiet strength Martin had seen in so many farm families over the years. Jake, now 17, had inherited his grandfather's love for the land and his mother's practical intelligence. Emma, 15, preferred books to barns, but still helped with chores when needed. Both children had learned to ride on Belle, just as their mother had, and their grandfather before her, Belle. Martin's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the mare, who had become as much a part of the Henderson family as any human member. 28 years old now, which was remarkable for a horse. Belle had been Tom's gift to his daughter Sarah on her 17th birthday. The quarter-horse mare had been gentle from the start, with a patient temperament that made her perfect for teaching children to ride. Over the years, Martin had watched Belle teach 3 generations of Hendersons the art of horsemanship. She'd carried Sarah through her teenage years, been her comfort during her mother's long illness, and stood, patient as a statue, while nervous grandchildren learned to brush her coat and clean her hooves. When Sarah's children were born, Belle seemed to understand her role as protector and teacher, never once offering even the slightest rebellion when small hands tugged at her mane or uncertain legs kicked her sides. The mare had earned her keep. 2, working cattle during roundups and carrying riders across hundreds of miles of Montana rangeland, but it was her role as family companion that made her irreplaceable. During Sarah's husband's cancer battle, Belle had been Jake's refuge. The boy would disappear to the barn for hours, talking to the horse about fears he couldn't share with his grieving mother. Martin finished his coffee and headed to the clinic, a converted barn that had served the community for 43 years. The morning appointment schedule was light: a routine vaccination for the miller's cattle, a follow-up on Mrs. Peterson's arthritic golden retriever, and a wellness check for a new foal born the week before. These were the easy cases that filled his days now, a far cry from the emergency surgeries and dramatic rescues that had defined his earlier career. As he unlocked the clinic door, Martin reflected on how the profession had changed during his 5 decades of practice. Modern veterinary medicine had advanced dramatically. Better anesthetics, sophisticated imaging equipment, surgical techniques that seemed miraculous compared to what his grandfather had worked with. Yet the fundamental challenge remained the same: helping animals while supporting the humans who loved them. The phone rang as he was organizing supplies for the day's calls. "Caldwell Veterinary," he answered, recognizing the number on the caller ID. "Martin, it's Tom Henderson." The voice carried the weight of years and worry. "I hate to bother you this early, but I wanted to catch you before you got busy. It's about Belle." Martin's attention sharpened. In all his years of practice, he'd learned to read the subtle variations in clients' voices, the difference between routine concern and genuine fear, between minor worry and the kind of dread that kept farmers awake at night. "What's going on with her, Tom?" "Well, she's eating fine, moving around normal, but Sarah noticed a lump on her neck yesterday morning. Small thing, maybe the size of a walnut. Could be nothing, but you know Belle, she's been perfect her whole life, never sick a day." Martin could hear the unspoken fear in Tom's voice. After nearly 3 decades, Belle had become more than livestock to the Henderson family. She was a living bridge to their past, a connection to happier times when the family was whole and the future seemed certain. "Where exactly is the lump located?" "Left side of her neck, about halfway down. Feels pretty firm, doesn't seem to bother her when you touch it. Sarah thinks maybe it's just age, but I'd feel better if you took a look." Martin glanced at his appointment book. The morning was manageable, and he'd learned long ago that peace of mind was often as important as medical treatment. "I can come by this afternoon, around 3 o'clock if that works for you." "That'd be perfect. I know it's probably nothing, but Tom, you've been bringing your animals to me for nearly 40 years. If you're concerned enough to call, it's worth checking. I'll see you at 3. After hanging up, Martin sat quietly for a moment, thinking about the inevitable march of time. Belle was 28, ancient for a horse. The Henderson family knew this intellectually, but emotionally, they weren't prepared for the reality that age brings. None of us ever are, he thought, remembering the difficulty of accepting his wife's diagnosis, the way they'd both pretended the treatments were working long after hope had faded. The day passed with its usual rhythm of examinations, treatments, and conversations with farmers who'd become friends over the decades. But Martin found his thoughts returning to Belle throughout the afternoon. Something in Tom's voice had triggered an instinct developed over 50 years of practice, a subtle warning that this might not be the routine call they all hoped it would be. As 3 o'clock approached, Martin loaded his truck with the portable examination equipment and drove the familiar route to the Henderson farm. The countryside rolled past in its summer glory. Fields of hay ready for cutting, cattle grazing in pastures that had fed Henderson livestock for 4 generations, and mountains rising in the distance like ancient guardians watching over the valley. The Henderson place had the weathered beauty of a working ranch. Barns and outbuildings that had been maintained but never prettied up, fences that ran straight and true across rolling hills, and the kind of practical organization that spoke of people who understood the rhythm of agricultural life. The main house sat on a slight rise, surrounded by mature cottonwoods that provided shade during the hot summer months. Tom was waiting by the barn when Martin pulled up, his weathered face creased with the worry lines that come from a lifetime of caring for animals. Sarah emerged from the house, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her expression a mixture of hope and concern. "Thanks for coming out, Martin," Tom said, extending his hand. "Belle's in the paddock behind the barn. She seems fine otherwise, eating well, moving normal." They walked together toward the fenced area where Belle stood in the shade of an old apple tree. Even at 28, she was still beautiful, a classic quarter horse with intelligent eyes and the kind of presence that spoke of years spent as a trusted partner rather than just livestock. Her coat gleamed with the attention that comes from regular grooming, and her posture suggested comfort and contentment. But as Martin approached and began his examination, running his experienced hands along Belle's neck, he felt something that made his heart sink. The lump was indeed small and seemed innocuous to the untrained touch, but there was something about its texture, its firmness, and the way it seemed to be attached to the surrounding tissue that triggered every alarm bell in his professional experience. He'd felt this before, too many times over the years, and each time it had led to the same devastating diagnosis. As he continued his examination, Martin's expression remained calm and professional. But inside, he was already beginning to prepare for one of the most difficult conversations of his career. The drive home from the Henderson farm felt longer than usual, though Martin had traveled these same winding country roads thousands of times over the decades. The late afternoon sun slanted through his truck's windshield, casting everything in that golden light that photographers loved, but that now seemed somehow ominous to his troubled mind. He'd maintained his professional composure during the examination, explaining to Tom and Sarah that he wanted to run some additional tests before making any definitive assessment, but the truth was already forming in his chest like a cold stone. Titchy. Voicemail was waiting when he arrived home, the red light blinking insistently on his answering machine. He recognized Tom's voice immediately, though it sounded different in the recording, thinner, more fragile, carrying the weight of a man who'd spent the evening thinking about possibilities he didn't want to face. "Martin, it's Tom Henderson. I know it's late, probably close to 10 o'clock now, but I can't sleep and I keep thinking about Belle. Sarah went home after dinner, and I've been sitting out here in the barn with her." There was a pause, and Martin could hear the familiar sounds of horses settling for the night in the background. "I've been running my hands over that lump, and I keep remembering what you said about additional tests. The way you looked when you felt it today, well, it reminded me of how Dr. Peterson looked when he examined my father before he told us about the cancer." Another pause, longer this time, filled with the kind of silence that speaks louder than words. "I know you can't give me answers over the phone, and I'm not asking you to, but Belle, she's been with us through everything, Martin." She carried Sarah to her first day of school, stood patient as Job while the kids learned to ride, never once offered to buck or bite, even when they pulled her tail or forgot to bring carrots. When Sarah's husband was sick, Jake would come out here and just lean against Belle's neck, and somehow that horse knew to stand extra still. The voice on the recording grew quieter, more reflective. I'm 73 years old, and I've buried my parents, my wife, and too many good dogs to count. I thought I understood how to say goodbye. But Belle, she's different. She's been the constant in our family for 28 years. 3 generations of us have trusted her with our children, our secrets, our grief. I don't know how to prepare Sarah and the kids for the possibility that we might lose her. Martin could hear Tom moving around in the barn, probably checking water buckets or adjusting blankets, the kind of nervous activity that keeps hands busy when the mind won't settle. I remember when my father was dying. He told me that the hardest part wasn't facing his own death, but watching what it did to the people who loved him. I think I understand what he meant now. Belle doesn't know what that lump might mean, but we do. She's just being Belle, gentle, patient, trusting us to take care of her like she's taken care of us all these years. There was a sound that might have been Tom clearing his throat or stifling something deeper. Anyway, I know you'll call when you have more information. I just needed to say these things out loud, I guess. To tell someone who understands that losing Belle wouldn't just be losing a horse. It would be like losing a piece of our family's heart. Take care, Martin. The machine clicked off, leaving Martin alone in his kitchen with the weight of Tom's words and his own growing certainty about what those test results would reveal. He'd been in practice long enough to recognize the signs, to know when a simple examination had uncovered something far more serious than anyone hoped. Unable to sleep, Martin found himself walking to his study, where shelves lined with veterinary journals and medical texts surrounded a desk that had belonged to his father. He pulled down a familiar volume on equine oncology and opened it to pages he'd hoped never to reference again. The clinical descriptions and treatment protocols were written in the dry, precise language of medical science. But behind every statistic and symptom description lay stories like the one unfolding with Belle. Families facing impossible choices. Animals who trusted their humans to make decisions beyond their understanding. The phone rang at 6:47 the next morning, earlier than any reasonable person should be calling. But Martin was already awake, sitting in his kitchen with coffee that had grown cold while he stared out at the sunrise. "Martin, it's Tom again. I'm sorry to call so early, but I haven't slept, and I keep thinking about yesterday, about the way you touched that lump, how careful you were, how long you spent examining her. In all the years you've been our vet, I've never seen you look quite like that." Martin closed his eyes, knowing this conversation was inevitable, but wishing he had better news to offer. "Tom, I need to bring some equipment out this morning for a more thorough examination. What I felt yesterday concerns me enough that we need to get a clearer picture of what we're dealing with. How concerned should we be?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with all the love and fear that comes from nearly 3 decades of partnership with an animal who'd become family. Martin had learned over the years that honesty, delivered with compassion, was always better than false hope, but he also knew that diagnostic certainty required proper testing. Concerned. "Enough that I want to rule out some serious possibilities. I'll be there around 9 o'clock with the portable ultrasound. Is Sarah available to be there?" "She's already here. Spent the night in the guest room. Jake's here too. He drove over after school yesterday and never left. That boy's got a special connection with Belle." Martin thought about 17-year-old Jake, who'd grown up in Belle's shadow, learning responsibility and gentleness from a horse who'd taught those lessons to his mother and grandfather before him. The boy had been struggling since his father's death 5 years earlier, finding solace in the barn when the weight of loss became too heavy for teenage shoulders to bear. "Tom, I want you and your family to understand that whatever we find this morning, we'll face it together. Belle has had 28 good years, and she's been loved every single day of those years. That matters, regardless of what comes next." "I know it does, Martin. I just wish I could make this easier for her somehow." "You already have, Tom. For 28 years, you've given her the best life any horse could ask for. That doesn't stop being true because of what we might discover today. After hanging up, Martin loaded his truck with the portable ultrasound machine and additional diagnostic equipment, knowing that the next few hours would likely confirm his worst fears. The drive to the Henderson farm felt like traveling toward an ending he didn't want to write, a conclusion to a story that had been filled with joy and partnership for nearly 3 decades. As he pulled into the familiar driveway, Martin could see the family gathered by the barn, Tom standing with his hands shoved deep in his pockets, Sarah leaning against the fence with her arms crossed, and Jake sitting on a hay bale with his head down. Their body language told the story of people preparing for news they didn't want to hear, but determined to face it together. Belle stood in the paddock, unaware of the weight of worry surrounding her, simply being the same gentle, trusting horse she'd always been. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her mane, highlighting the dignity with which she'd carried her years. In a few minutes, Martin would begin the examination that would likely change everything for this family, but for now, Belle was still just Belle, patient, beautiful, and completely trusting in the humans who devoted themselves to her care. The weight of what he suspected he would find pressed heavily on Martin's shoulders as he began unloading his equipment, preparing to deliver news that would test every lesson he'd learned about compassion, honesty, and the terrible responsibility that comes with being the bridge between hope and heartbreak. The portable ultrasound machine hummed quietly in the morning stillness as Martin adjusted the settings with the practiced precision of 5 decades in veterinary medicine. The Henderson family stood in a semicircle around Belle, their faces reflecting the kind of anxious hope that Martin had witnessed countless times throughout his career. The desperate wish that technology might prove their fears unfounded, that what felt wrong might somehow be revealed as harmless. Belle stood, with her characteristic patience, occasionally turning her head to nuzzle Jake's shoulder as he held her lead rope. The 17-year-old's hands trembled slightly, betraying the calm demeanor he was trying to maintain for his family's sake. Sarah had positioned herself where she could see both the ultrasound screen and her son's face, ready to provide support wherever it might be needed. Tom stood slightly apart, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching Martin's every movement with the intensity of someone seeking reassurance in familiar competence. "I'm going to apply some gel to help with the imaging," Martin explained, his voice steady and professional despite the growing certainty in his chest. Belle might find it a little cold, but it won't hurt her. As he pressed the ultrasound transducer against Belle's neck, the screen flickered to life with the grey and black patterns that most people found incomprehensible, but that told Martin everything he needed to know. Years of experience had taught him to read these images like others read books, to see the subtle variations in tissue density and blood flow that revealed the body's secrets. What he saw on the screen confirmed his worst fears. The mass was larger than external examination, had suggested with irregular borders that spoke of aggressive growth. Worse, the blood flow patterns indicated a level of vascularization that pointed toward malignancy. Martin's expression remained carefully neutral, but inside, his heart was breaking for the family who stood waiting for news they weren't prepared to hear. "What do you see, Martin?" Tom's voice carried the forced calm of someone trying to brace for impact. Martin paused the image and pointed to the screen, knowing that honesty delivered with compassion was always better than false hope, even when the truth was devastating. "The mass is more extensive than I initially thought. It's approximately 5 centimeters at its widest point, and the borders are irregular. I'm also seeing increased blood flow to the area, which can indicate rapid growth." Sarah moved closer to the screen, her practical nature demanding details even as her heart recoiled from their implications. What does that mean for Belle? For her comfort, her quality of life? Right now, she doesn't appear to be experiencing any discomfort. The mass isn't interfering with her breathing or swallowing, and her appetite and behavior are normal. But given the characteristics I'm seeing, I'm concerned about the nature of this growth. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. "Are you saying it's cancer?" Martin turned off the ultrasound machine and gave the young man his full attention. In all his years of practice, he'd learned that the moment of diagnosis was as much about providing emotional support as medical information. "I can't make a definitive diagnosis without additional testing, but the imaging suggests we're dealing with something serious. I'd like to take some tissue samples and send them for analysis." The word biopsy hung unspoken in the air, carrying all the weight and fear that such procedures implied. Tom ran his hand through his grey hair, a gesture Martin had seen him make whenever he was processing difficult information about his livestock or family. "How long before we'd have results?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with controlled emotion. 3 to 5 days for preliminary results, possibly longer for complete analysis. "I know waiting is difficult, but we need accurate information to make the best decisions for Belle." As Martin prepared the biopsy equipment, he found himself thinking about all the times he'd stood in this same position, between an animal's trust and a family's heartbreak, holding knowledge that would change everything for people who'd loved completely and without reservation. It was the most difficult aspect of veterinary medicine, the weight of being the messenger who delivered news that shattered carefully constructed hopes. The biopsy procedure itself was quick and relatively simple. Belle barely flinched as Martin extracted the small tissue samples, her trust in him complete and unquestioning. That trust, Martin reflected, was both the greatest privilege and heaviest burden of his profession. Animals gave their faith so completely, never understanding that the hands that had always brought healing might someday be the ones to deliver sorrow. "I'll get these samples to the lab this afternoon," Martin said as he packed his equipment. "In the meantime, keep Belle's routine as normal as possible. Continue her regular feeding and exercise. Watch for any changes in appetite, behavior, or breathing, and call me immediately if you notice anything concerning." Jake stepped forward, his young face serious beyond his years. "Dr. Caldwell, if it is cancer, what happens then? What are the options?" The question demonstrated a maturity that reminded Martin of Jake's father, who'd faced his own diagnosis with similar directness 5 years earlier. Martin chose his words carefully, knowing that hope balanced with realism was the kindest approach. Treatment. Options depend on the specific type and stage of any malignancy. Some forms respond well to treatment, others are more challenging. "But Jake, let's wait for the biopsy results before we start planning for possibilities. Right now, Belle is comfortable and happy. That's what matters most." As Martin loaded his equipment into the truck, Sarah approached him with the quiet determination that had carried her through widowhood and single parenthood. "Martin, I need you to be completely honest with me. In your experience, what do you think we're looking at?" He paused, considering how to balance truth with compassion. "The imaging characteristics are concerning, Sarah. The irregular borders, the vascularization, the size, they're consistent with aggressive growth. I hope I'm wrong, but I want you and your family to be prepared for difficult news." Sarah nodded, absorbing the information with the kind of practical acceptance that came from having faced life's cruelties before. "I appreciate your honesty. It's better to know what we might be dealing with than to be blindsided. How are you holding up? This can't be easy, especially with everything your family has been through." "We'll manage. We always do. But Belle, she's been our constant through all of it. When David was sick, when the kids were struggling with losing their father, Belle was always there. She's been the stable thing in our lives when everything else was falling apart." Martin understood. Over the years, he'd seen how animals became the emotional anchors for families navigating tragedy. They provided comfort without judgment, presence without demands, and love without conditions. The prospect of losing such a source of stability was devastating in ways that went far beyond the simple loss of a beloved pet. The drive back to town gave Martin time to process the morning's findings and prepare for the difficult days ahead. The tissue samples sat in a cooler on his passenger seat, small fragments that would soon provide answers no one wanted to hear. He'd spent 50 years delivering both good news and bad, but cases like Belle's never became easier. If anything, they became harder as experience taught him to recognize the signs earlier and understand more completely what lay ahead for the families involved. The 3 days that followed felt suspended in time, each hour stretching longer than the last, as the Henderson family maintained their routines while privately wrestling with possibilities they couldn't voice. Belle's feeding bucket, that simple metal container worn smooth by decades of daily use, had become a symbol of normalcy in a world suddenly filled with uncertainty. Each morning and evening, Jake filled it with the same careful measure of grain and supplements, the familiar ritual providing comfort even as fear gnawed at the edges of their thoughts. Martin found himself checking his phone more frequently than usual, knowing the lab results wouldn't arrive any faster, but unable to resist the compulsion. In his 5 decades of practice, he'd never grown comfortable with the waiting periods that stretched between diagnosis and confirmation, the liminal spaces where hope and dread existed in equal measure. He'd learned to recognize the weight these intervals carried for families, how they transformed ordinary moments into exercises in emotional endurance. His own sleep had become fitful, filled with memories of similar cases that had ended badly, and the faces of families who'd trusted him to guide them through impossible decisions. There was Mrs. Patterson's ancient collie who'd lived 3 good months after a terminal diagnosis, and the Marlin's young gelding who'd seemed perfectly healthy until a sudden collapse revealed widespread cancer. Each case had taught him something about the delicate balance between hope and acceptance, but none had prepared him adequately for the next one. Wednesday morning brought Tom Henderson to the clinic, ostensibly to pick up routine medications for his cattle, but clearly seeking the kind of reassurance that only comes from human connection during times of uncertainty. He stood in Martin's office, his weathered hat rotating slowly in his hands, talking around the subject that consumed his thoughts. "Belle ate all her breakfast this morning," Tom said, as if normal appetite could somehow ward off malignant cells. "Jake's been spending every free moment with her. I found him sleeping in her stall yesterday morning. Said he wanted to make sure she wasn't lonely." Martin understood the boy's impulse. At 17, Jake was old enough to understand mortality, but still young enough to believe that love might be sufficient protection against loss. It was the same magical thinking that had led Martin to spend countless hours by his wife's bedside during her final illness, as if presence alone could hold back the inevitable. "How's Sarah handling things?" Martin asked, knowing that the practical burdens of uncertainty often fell heaviest on the person trying to hold everyone else together. "You know Sarah, keeping busy, managing the farm, making sure the kids don't fall apart. But I catch her sometimes, just standing by Belle's paddock with this look on her face. Same expression she had during David's treatments, when she was trying to be strong for everyone else." The comparison to Sarah's late husband wasn't lost on Martin. He'd watched families navigate terminal illness before, had seen how the prospect of losing a beloved animal could reopen wounds that had never fully healed. For the Henderson family, Belle's illness wasn't just about losing a horse. It was about confronting mortality again, about facing the reality that love, no matter how deep, couldn't protect against loss. That afternoon, Martin made what he told himself was a routine farm call to check on the miller's new calf, but the route happened to take him past the Henderson place. As he drove by, he could see Jake in the paddock with Belle, the two of them silhouetted against the afternoon sky. The boy was brushing the mare's coat with the kind of meticulous attention that spoke of someone trying to memorize every detail, to preserve something precious against an uncertain future. Martin's phone rang as he continued toward the Miller farm, the caller ID showing the laboratory number he'd been anticipating with growing dread. He pulled over to the side of the country road, surrounded by fields of summer hay that seemed almost mockingly peaceful, given the conversation he was about to have. "Dr. Caldwell, this is Patricia from Mountain State Veterinary Pathology. I have the results from the equine tissue samples you submitted Monday. Martin closed his eyes, steeling himself for confirmation of what he'd already suspected. Go ahead, Patricia. The histopathology shows a high-grade lymphosarcoma with extensive invasion into surrounding tissues. The cellular characteristics indicate an aggressive form with rapid proliferation rates. I'm sorry, Dr. Caldwell. This isn't the news anyone wants to deliver. The clinical language couldn't soften the devastating reality. Belle had cancer, and it was the kind that moved fast and showed no mercy. Martin thanked Patricia for the thorough analysis and sat in his truck for several minutes afterward, watching clouds drift across the Montana sky while he processed the weight of what he now knew for certain. Lymphosarcoma in horses was particularly cruel because it often struck animals who appeared perfectly healthy, giving families no time to prepare for the emotional tsunami that would follow. The prognosis was measured in weeks or months rather than years, and treatment options were limited and rarely successful. Belle would likely remain comfortable for some time, but the cancer was already advanced enough that any intervention would be more about managing the family's grief than extending the horse's life. The drive to the Miller farm passed in a blur of automatic responses and professional competence, while Martin's mind worked through the conversation he would need to have with the Henderson family. He delivered similar news hundreds of times over the years, but it never became routine. Each family's love was unique, their grief particular to their own history and circumstances. By evening, Martin had finished his scheduled calls and returned to his empty house, where the silence felt heavier than usual. Eleanor's absence was particularly acute on days like this, when he needed someone who understood the weight of carrying other people's heartbreak. She'd been his anchor through 50 years of veterinary practice, the person who helped him process the emotional toll of being present for both joy and devastation in equal measure. He found himself standing in his study, looking at the photographs that lined the shelves. Decades of Christmas cards from grateful families, pictures of successful surgeries and healthy animals, memories of a career spent in service to the bond between humans and their animal companions. In a few hours, he would call the Henderson family and forever change their understanding of Belle's future. The words he spoke would mark the beginning of their goodbye, would transform their gentle mare from a healthy member of the family into a patient with limited time. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than it ever had, perhaps because at 70, Martin was beginning to understand more personally what it meant to face the reality of finite time. Belle's diagnosis was a reminder that all love comes with the inevitable cost of loss, that the depth of our caring is measured by the pain we're willing to accept when goodbye becomes unavoidable. The phone call Martin had been dreading came Thursday evening, just as the sun was setting behind the mountains. He'd rehearsed the conversation countless times during the sleepless hours of the previous night, searching for words that might soften the devastating blow he was about to deliver. But 50 years of experience had taught him that there was no gentle way to tell a family that their beloved companion was dying. Tom, it's Martin. I have the results from Belle's biopsy, and I think it would be best if we could all sit down together to discuss them. Are you available tomorrow morning? The pause that followed stretched long enough for Martin to hear the television in the background, the normal sounds of evening routine that would soon be shattered by knowledge that changed everything. That bad, huh? Tom's voice carried the resignation of a man who'd lived long enough to recognize the weight of carefully chosen words. It's serious, Tom. Serious enough that we need to talk about options and make some important decisions together. I'll call Sarah and Jake. Can you come by around 10 tomorrow morning? I'll be there. The next morning dawned gray and overcast, the kind of Montana weather that seemed to mirror the mood of the conversation ahead. Martin drove to the Henderson farm with the weight of clinical knowledge pressing against his chest. the laboratory report on the passenger seat beside him, like an unwelcome passenger carrying news of mortality and loss. The family was waiting in the kitchen when he arrived, gathered around the same oak table where 3 generations of Hendersons had shared meals, made plans, and weathered the storms that come with agricultural life. Tom sat with his weathered hands wrapped around a coffee cup. Sarah occupied the chair closest to the window, where she could see Belle grazing peacefully in the paddock, and Jake perched on the edge of his seat with the restless energy of someone too anxious to fully settle. Tom's photo album lay open on the table, decades of family memories captured in fading color photographs that told the story of Belle's integration into their lives. There was 5-year-old Sarah taking her first riding lesson, her face bright with excitement as Belle stood patient as stone. Sarah as a teenager, jumping Belle over homemade obstacles with the fearless confidence of youth. Wedding photos showing Belle decorated with flowers, carrying Sarah and her new husband across the pasture after their outdoor ceremony. More recent pictures showed Jake and his sister Emma learning the same lessons their mother had learned decades earlier. Belle's patient expression unchanged by the passage of years. There were Christmas morning photos with Belle wearing a red bow, birthday pictures with children feeding her carrots, and countless ordinary moments that had become precious simply because they documented the presence of someone deeply loved. Martin cleared his throat gently, drawing their attention back to the present moment. I received the biopsy results yesterday afternoon, and I wanted to share them with you personally rather than over the phone. Sarah straightened in her chair, her practical nature demanding direct information even as her heart braced for impact. What did they find? Belle has lymphosarcoma, a type of cancer that affects the lymphatic system. The biopsy shows it's a high-grade form, which means it's aggressive and likely to progress quickly. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire no one wanted to acknowledge. Jake's face went pale, his 17-year-old world suddenly forced to confront the reality that even the most constant presences in life could be temporary. What does that mean for her? Tom asked, his voice steady despite the tremor Martin could see in his hands. For her comfort, her quality of life. Martin had delivered this explanation many times over the years, but it never became easier to watch hope crumble in the faces of people who'd loved without reservation. Right now, Belle appears comfortable and isn't showing signs of pain or distress. Lymphosarcoma can remain relatively stable for a period of time before progressing more rapidly. Based on the extent of the disease I saw in the imaging and biopsy results, we're likely looking at weeks to a few months. Sarah's practical questions came rapid fire, the way they always did when she was processing difficult information. Are there treatment options, chemotherapy, radiation, surgery? There are treatments available, but I have to be honest about their limitations. Chemotherapy for lymphosarcoma in horses is not as advanced as it is for humans or even dogs and cats. The protocols are experimental, expensive, and often cause significant side effects while offering modest extensions of life. Jake spoke for the first time since Martin had begun explaining, his voice tight with emotion. But there's a chance? Even a small one? Martin's heart broke a little more for the young man who was still at an age where fighting against impossible odds seemed preferable to acceptance. There's always a chance, Jake, but we have to weigh the potential benefits against the stress and discomfort that aggressive treatment would cause Belle. She's 28 years old, which is quite elderly for a horse. Her body might not tolerate intensive treatment well. Tom leaned back in his chair, his face showing the kind of weariness that comes from a lifetime of making difficult decisions about animals under his care. What would you do, Martin, if Belle were your horse? The question was one Martin had been asked countless times over the decades, and he'd learned that families needed the perspective of someone who could balance love with professional objectivity. If Belle were mine, I'd focus on keeping her comfortable and maintaining her quality of life for as long as possible. I'd watch her closely for any signs of pain or distress, and I'd make decisions day by day based on how she's feeling rather than trying to fight a battle that would cause her suffering. Sarah reached across the table to take her father's hand. "Dad, we need to think about what's best for Belle, not what's easiest for us." "I know that, honey. I've always known that. It's just—" Tom's voice caught, and he paused to compose himself. "She's been with us for so long, through your mother's illness, when David was sick, when the kids were babies. She's been the one constant thing in our lives that never changed, never asked for anything except grain and hay and a little kindness." Jake pushed back from the table abruptly, his chair scraping against the worn linoleum. "I need some air," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he headed for the back door. Through the kitchen window they watched him walk to Belle's paddock, where the mare lifted her head from grazing to acknowledge his approach with the gentle attention she'd always given to the children in her care. Jake wrapped his arms around her neck, his shoulders shaking with the kind of grief that comes from understanding that love, no matter how deep, can't protect against loss. The faded blue ribbon hanging from Belle's stall bore the inscription, "First Place Western Pleasure, Gallatin County Fair, 2004. Sarah found herself staring at it 2 days after receiving Belle's diagnosis, remembering that perfect August afternoon when Belle had carried her through the competition with the kind of smooth, collected gait that made riding look effortless. It had been one of the last times Sarah had competed before David's illness consumed their lives, before responsibilities and grief had gradually replaced the simple joy of partnership with her horse. The ribbon represented more than just a competition. Victory. It symbolized a time when the future had seemed certain, when Belle's strength and reliability were taken for granted rather than treasured as precious and temporary. Now, as Sarah stood in the barn surrounded by the familiar scents of hay and leather, that blue ribbon felt like an artifact from a different lifetime, a reminder of all the moments they'd shared without understanding their finite nature. The family had spent the weekend in a strange state of suspended animation, maintaining Belle's routine while privately wrestling with the weight of her diagnosis. Tom had thrown himself into ranch work with increased intensity, as if physical labor might somehow hold back the inevitable. Jake had barely left Belle's side, camping out in the barn and finding excuses to avoid the house where conversations about treatment options and quality of life hung heavy in the air. Sarah had found herself caught between her father's denial and her son's desperate hope, trying to balance her own grief with the practical responsibilities of managing everyone else's emotional needs. It was a familiar role. She'd occupied the same position during David's illness, serving as the bridge between medical reality and the hope that love might somehow be enough to change outcomes. Monday morning brought Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the University's Veterinary Teaching Hospital, a specialist in equine oncology whom Martin had contacted for a second opinion. Sarah appreciated Martin's thoroughness, even as she suspected that expert consultation would only confirm what they already knew. Sometimes the weight of hope required multiple voices before acceptance became possible. Dr. Walsh was younger than Sarah had expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of precise competence that came from years of specialization in cases where outcomes were rarely optimistic. She examined Belle with methodical care, reviewing Martin's findings and conducting her own ultrasound examination while the family watched with the kind of attention that sought miracles in technical procedures. "Dr. Caldwell's assessment is accurate," Dr. Walsh said as she completed her examination. "The lymphosarcoma is extensive and aggressive. I can offer experimental treatment protocols that might extend Belle's life by several weeks or possibly months, but I need to be clear about what that would involve." She turned to face the family directly, her expression compassionate but unflinchingly honest. "The chemotherapy protocol would require weekly treatments for at least 6 weeks, each one involving a 4-hour drive to the university hospital. Belle would need to be hospitalized overnight for monitoring after each treatment. The medications can cause nausea, fatigue, and potentially serious side effects to her liver and kidneys." Jake stepped forward, his young face determined despite the fear in his eyes. But it could help her. It could give us more time. It might, Dr. Walsh replied carefully. But Jake, I need you to understand what more time means in this context. We're not talking about a cure. We're talking about possibly slowing the progression of the disease while subjecting Belle to treatments that will make her feel sick and keep her away from everything familiar and comfortable. Tom had been listening in silence, his weathered face reflecting decades of making difficult decisions about animals under his care. Doctor, in your professional opinion, would Belle understand why we were putting her through that? Would she know we were trying to help her? It was the kind of question that cut to the heart of veterinary ethics, the balance between human need and animal welfare that defined the most difficult cases. Dr. Walsh considered her answer carefully. Horses live in the present moment, Tom. Belle wouldn't understand that temporary discomfort was meant to help her long term. She would only know that she felt sick, that she was away from home, that her routine was disrupted. The question you need to ask yourselves is whether extending her life through treatment would be for Belle's benefit or for yours. The honesty was brutal, but necessary. Sarah felt tears threatening for the first time since receiving the diagnosis, not from the confirmation of Belle's terminal condition, but from the recognition that their love for her might not align with what was truly best for her. Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. So we're supposed to just give up, just let her die? Martin, who had been quietly observing the consultation, stepped forward to place a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder. Jake, there's a difference between giving up and choosing love over fear. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is accept what we cannot change and focus on making the time we have left as good as possible. But she seems fine now, Jake protested. She's eating, she's moving around normally. Maybe the doctors are wrong, maybe they are, Sarah said softly, recognizing her son's need to hope, even as she accepted the reality they faced. But Jake, we can't make decisions based on what we wish were true. We have to make them based on what is true. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about palliative care, pain management, and the warning signs that would indicate Belle's condition was deteriorating. Dr. Walsh left them with her contact information and the promise that she would be available for consultation if Belle's comfort became compromised. After the specialist departed, the family sat in the barn with Belle, each lost in their own thoughts about impossible choices and limited time. The blue ribbon caught Sarah's eye again, reminding her of all the afternoons they'd spent training for that competition, the patient hours Belle had devoted to learning the precise movements that would earn them recognition. That ribbon represented more than just achievement. It symbolized partnership, trust, and the kind of communication that develops between horse and rider over years of working together. Belle had given her everything that summer, had carried her dreams and trusted in her guidance with the complete faith that defined their relationship. Now it was Sarah's turn to be worthy of that trust, to make decisions that honored Belle's dignity rather than their own reluctance to say goodbye. The blue ribbon hung silently in the evening light, a testament to everything they'd shared, and a reminder that the greatest victories sometimes required the courage to accept defeat with grace. Martin's hands trembled slightly as he opened the manila envelope that had been waiting in his mailbox when he returned from the Henderson farm. The return address bore the letterhead of his own physician, Dr. Robert Chen, and the weight of the contents seemed disproportionate to the thin sheaf of papers inside. He'd almost forgotten about the routine physical examination he'd undergone 3 weeks earlier, the standard battery of tests that men his age endured annually more out of habit than genuine concern. The medical records inside told a story Martin wasn't prepared to read. Elevated PSA levels, abnormal imaging results, recommendations for immediate biopsy, and consultation with an oncologist. The clinical language was familiar from his veterinary practice, but seeing it applied to his own body created a strange disconnection, as if he were reading about someone else's mortality rather than confronting his own. He sat in his truck in the clinic parking lot, the Henderson farm visible in the distance across rolling pastures that had witnessed decades of life and death in their natural cycles. The irony wasn't lost on him. While he'd been examining Belle for cancer, his own body had been harboring the same kind of cellular rebellion that was stealing time from the gentle mare he'd grown to love over nearly 3 decades. The parallels were unsettling. Like Belle, he'd been feeling perfectly normal, going about his daily routines without any awareness that something fundamental had changed inside him. Like Belle, he was in the later years of life, when the body's defenses became less reliable and time took on new meaning. And like Belle, he now faced the prospect of treatment decisions that balanced hope against quality of life, fighting against acceptance. Martin found himself thinking about his estranged son, David, in Seattle, wondering how to bridge years of careful distance with news that demanded intimacy. Their relationship had never recovered from David's decision to pursue computer programming instead of veterinary medicine, a choice that Martin had interpreted as rejection of everything he'd devoted his life to building. Looking back now, he could see how his disappointment had created walls that neither of them had known how to dismantle. The phone call to Dr. Chen's office felt surreal, as if he were making arrangements for someone else's medical care rather than his own. The receptionist's cheerful efficiency in scheduling appointments and coordinating with specialists seemed to exist in a parallel universe where cancer was just another item on a to-do list, rather than a fundamental disruption of everything familiar and safe. Dr. Caldwell, Dr. Chen would like to see you Thursday afternoon to discuss the results and next steps, the voice on the phone said. He's also arranged for you to meet with Dr. Patricia Morrison, our oncology specialist, on Friday morning. Next steps. The phrase carried the same weight it did when he used it with clients facing difficult decisions about their animals. It implied that there were choices to be made, paths to be chosen, hope to be managed alongside reality. Martin had guided countless families through similar conversations, but being on the receiving end felt like learning a foreign language in which he was only partially fluent. That evening, he found himself standing in his study surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of 50 years in veterinary practice. The shelves lined with medical texts and journals now seemed to mock him with their focus on healing others, while his own body harbored the same cellular chaos he diagnosed in countless patients. The framed veterinary oath on his wall caught his eye, its formal language promising to prevent animal suffering and promote animal welfare. He'd lived by those words for 5 decades, but now faced the reality that his own suffering might soon require the same compassionate attention he'd devoted to his patients. The phone rang, interrupting his brooding thoughts. Tom Henderson's voice carried the weight of someone wrestling with impossible decisions. "Martin, I hope I'm not calling too late. We've been talking as a family about Belle, about what Dr. Walsh said, and I wanted to get your thoughts on something." Martin settled into his desk chair, grateful for the distraction from his own medical concerns. "Of course, Tom. What's on your mind?" "We've decided against the chemotherapy. Sarah helped us understand that it would be more for us than for Belle, and that's not fair to her. But Jake's struggling with feeling like we're giving up too easily. I was wondering if you might talk to him, help him understand that sometimes loving someone means letting them go peacefully." The request struck Martin with unexpected force, given his own recent diagnosis. Here was Tom asking him to help a 17-year-old accept mortality and make peace with loss, while Martin himself was just beginning to process the same challenges in his own life. "I'd be happy to talk with Jake," Martin said, his voice steadier than he felt. "These decisions are never easy, especially when you're young and still believe that love should be enough to protect against loss." "He's been sleeping in the barn," Again, says he wants to make sure Belle doesn't feel abandoned. Sarah's worried about him, but I think he just needs time to process what letting go actually means. After ending the call, Martin sat in the growing darkness of his study, thinking about the strange parallels between his situation and Belle's. Both faced uncertain prognoses. Both would need to make decisions about treatment versus quality of life, and both were surrounded by people who loved them enough to hope for miracles while preparing for loss. The difference, Martin realized, was that Belle had the advantage of living entirely in the present moment. She couldn't anticipate suffering that hadn't yet arrived, couldn't waste emotional energy on futures that might never materialize. She simply existed in each day as it came, trusting in the care and love that surrounded her without the burden of understanding her own mortality. Martin envied that simplicity, even as he recognized his own need to grapple with the complexity of human awareness. Unlike Belle, he could make informed decisions about his treatment, could choose how to spend whatever time remained, could take steps to repair relationships that distance and pride had damaged. His diagnosis, devastating as it felt, also carried opportunities that animals never had. The chance to find meaning in endings, to transform knowledge of mortality into appreciation for life. The next morning brought new perspective as Martin drove to the Henderson farm to check on Belle and talk with Jake. The countryside looked different somehow, more vivid and precious, as if his own diagnosis had adjusted his vision to see beauty he'd been taking for granted. The familiar landscape of pastures and mountains seemed to pulse with significance, every detail worth noticing and remembering. Belle stood in her paddock, grazing peacefully in the morning sun, her silver-threaded coat gleaming with the kind of dignity that comes from aging gracefully. She looked up as Martin's truck approached, her gentle eyes reflecting the trust that had defined their relationship for nearly 3 decades. In that moment, Martin understood something profound about the gift she was offering them all, the opportunity to practice love without conditions, to experience grief as the price of deep connection, and to find grace in the space between holding on and letting go. His own medical records lay folded in his shirt pocket, carrying news that would change everything about his future. But standing there watching Belle return to her grazing, Martin felt something shift inside him, a recognition that diagnosis didn't have to mean defeat, that knowledge of mortality could become wisdom about living, and that sometimes the most profound teaching came from those who faced the end with dignity and peace. The veterinary oath plaque had hung on Martin's office wall for 43 years, its formal language etched in brass and mounted on polished walnut. Being admitted to the profession of veterinary medicine, I solemnly swear to use my scientific knowledge and skills for the benefit of society through the protection of animal health and welfare, the prevention and relief of animal suffering, and the conservation of animal resources. The words had guided his career through thousands of cases, but never had they carried more weight than they did now, as he prepared for what might be his final act as both healer and patient. The appointment with Dr. Chen had confirmed what Martin already suspected: aggressive prostate cancer that had likely begun spreading beyond the original site. The oncologist, Dr. Morrison, had outlined treatment options with the same careful balance of hope and realism that Martin had practiced throughout his own career. Radiation therapy, hormone treatments, chemotherapy protocols that might extend his life while compromising its quality. The irony of facing the same decisions he'd been helping the Henderson family navigate with Belle wasn't lost on him. The treatments could give you additional years, Dr. Morrison had explained, her voice carrying the professional compassion Martin recognized from his own difficult conversations. But they come with significant side effects: fatigue, nausea, potential complications that could impact your ability to continue practicing veterinary medicine. Martin had listened with the strange detachment of someone hearing their life reduced to statistics and treatment protocols, understanding for the first time what his clients experienced when he delivered similar information about their beloved animals. The choice between quantity and quality of life took on new meaning when it applied to his own remaining time. Now, 3 days later, he stood in Belle's paddock, watching the mare graze peacefully in the morning sun, her behavior showing no signs of the cancer that was slowly claiming her life. She moved with the same gentle dignity she'd always possessed, occasionally lifting her head to acknowledge his presence before returning to the simple pleasure of fresh grass and warm sunshine. Jake was there too, sitting on the fence rail with the kind of restless energy that came from wrestling with impossible questions. At 17, he was caught between childhood's belief in happy endings and adult understanding that love couldn't protect against loss. Martin recognized the struggle. He'd watched it in countless families over the years, the painful process of accepting that caring deeply sometimes meant making choices that felt like betrayal. Dr. Caldwell, Jake said as Martin approached, "Mom and Grandpa say we need to stop fighting and just keep Belle comfortable. They say the chemotherapy would be more for us than for her." Martin leaned against the fence beside the young man, choosing his words carefully. The conversation felt different now, informed by his own recent diagnosis and the weight of decisions he was making about his own treatment. "What do you think, Jake? When you look at Belle right now, what do you see?" "I see the same horse who taught me to ride, who never once threw me off even when I was learning, and probably deserved it. I see someone who's been part of our family longer than I've been alive." Jake's voice carried the pain of someone forced to confront mortality before he felt ready. "But I also see that she trusts us to take care of her. She doesn't know what cancer means, doesn't understand why we're all looking at her differently." The insight surprised Martin with its maturity. "That's a very wise observation. Belle lives in the present moment. She doesn't worry about tomorrow or grieve for yesterday. Right now she's comfortable and surrounded by people who love her. That's all that matters to her." "But it feels like giving up," Jake said, his young voice thick with emotion. "Like we're supposed to fight harder, try everything possible." Martin thought about his own treatment decisions, the choice between aggressive intervention and accepting whatever time remained with grace and dignity. "Jake, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is accept what we cannot change and focus on, making the time we have left as meaningful as possible." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching Belle move slowly around the paddock with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned to savor simple pleasures. The morning sun caught the silver threads in her mane, highlighting the dignity with which she carried her years and her illness. "Dr. Caldwell," Jake said eventually, "will you be here? When it's time, I mean. Will you be the one to help her?" The Chadis question carried enormous trust, the kind of faith that Martin had spent 50 years earning through countless difficult moments with families facing loss. "If that's what you and your family want, Jake, then yes, I'll be here." Inside the farmhouse, Sarah and Tom were having their own difficult conversation about timing and decisions. Martin could see them through the kitchen window, their body language reflecting the weight of choices no one wanted to make. Sarah's practical nature warred with her emotional attachment, while Tom struggled with the reality that even perfect care couldn't prevent the inevitable. The family meeting that afternoon brought all the unspoken fears into the open. They gathered around the same kitchen table where they'd first learned about Belle's diagnosis, but the conversation had shifted from denial and desperate hope to acceptance and planning. It was a transition Martin had witnessed countless times. The gradual movement from fighting against reality to working within its constraints. The oncologist said Belle might have several good weeks left, possibly more, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "We want to make sure those weeks are spent here, doing the things she's always enjoyed." Tom nodded, his weathered hands folded on the table. "No more medical procedures unless she's in pain. No more trips to the university hospital. Just life as normal as we can make it." Martin felt a deep respect for the family's decision. understanding from personal experience how difficult it was to choose quality over quantity when time became precious. I think that's exactly what Belle would want if she could tell us. She's always been happiest here, with all of you, living the life she's known for 28 years. Jake looked up from his hands, his young face showing the kind of seriousness that comes from being forced to grow up too quickly. How will we know when it's time? How will we know when she's not comfortable anymore? The question went to the heart of veterinary medicine, the responsibility of recognizing when prolonging life became prolonging suffering. Martin had guided families through this decision hundreds of times, but his own recent diagnosis gave him new insight into the complexity of choosing when to fight and when to surrender. Belle will tell us, Martin said gently, not with words, but with her behavior. If she stops eating, if she seems restless or uncomfortable, if she withdraws from the things that usually bring her pleasure, those will be our signs. And when the time comes, if it comes, we'll make sure her last moments are peaceful and surrounded by love. The conversation continued for another hour, covering practical details about Belle's care and the warning signs to watch for. They discussed the logistics of euthanasia with the clinical detachment that made such discussions bearable, planning for possibilities no one wanted to face while hoping they wouldn't be necessary. As Martin prepared to leave, Tom walked with him to his truck, the two men comfortable in the silence that comes from decades of shared experience. They'd weathered many difficult cases together over the years, but this one felt different, more personal, more weighted with meaning beyond the simple medical facts. "Martin," Tom said as they reached the truck, "I want you to know how much it means to us that you're guiding us through this. Belle's been part of our family for so long, and knowing that you'll be there at the end, it gives us peace." Martin felt the weight of that trust, understanding that he was being asked to serve as more than just a veterinarian. He was being invited to participate in one of life's most sacred moments, to help a family say goodbye to someone they'd loved completely and without reservation. "It's been my privilege to care for Belle all these years," Martin replied, his voice carrying the emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "She's been a remarkable horse, and you've been remarkable owners. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." As he drove home through the familiar countryside, Martin thought about the parallel journeys he and Belle were traveling, both facing uncertain futures, both surrounded by people who loved them, both making choices about how to spend whatever time remained. The veterinary oath plaque in his office would witness his final cases with new meaning, its words about preventing suffering and promoting welfare taking on deeper significance as he learned what it meant to be both healer and patient in the same story. The syringe lay in Martin's veterinary bag like a small instrument of mercy, its plastic chamber filled with the pentobarbital solution that would end Belle's suffering with quiet dignity. He had prepared this same injection countless times over. 50 years of practice, but never had it carried more weight than it did this grey October morning. 3 weeks had passed since the family's decision to forego aggressive treatment. 3 weeks during which Belle had gradually declined from comfortable to concerned, to the point where love demanded the ultimate act of compassion. The call had come at dawn, Tom's voice thick with exhaustion and grief. "She's not eating, Martin. Hasn't touched her grain since yesterday morning, won't even take the apples Jake brings her. She's just standing in the corner of her stall, and when you look in her eyes..." His voice had broken then, unable to finish the sentence that would acknowledge what they all knew. Martin had dressed carefully that morning, choosing the clothes he wore for his most solemn professional duties. The drive to the Henderson farm felt like a pilgrimage, each familiar landmark along the route marking his progress toward a moment that would forever change the lives of people he'd grown to love over nearly 3 decades of shared care for. Their animals. The family was gathered in Belle's paddock when he arrived, their faces showing the particular exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights spent watching someone you love slip away. Jake sat on a hay bale near Belle's favorite apple tree, his 17-year-old frame hunched with grief that seemed too heavy for young shoulders to bear. Sarah stood with her arm around her father's shoulders, both of them studying Belle with the kind of attention that seeks to memorize every detail before it's gone. Belle herself stood in the corner of the paddock, her once bright eyes now dull with the kind of discomfort that spoke louder than any clinical examination. The cancer had finally claimed enough of her body to overwhelm her gentle spirit, transforming the patient, trusting horse they'd known into someone who was simply tired of carrying pain. "She hasn't moved from that spot since yesterday evening," Sarah said quietly as Martin approached. "Just stands there with her head down, like she's waiting for something." Martin didn't need to conduct an examination to understand what Belle was waiting for. In 50 years of veterinary practice, he'd learned to recognize the signs of an animal ready to let go. The subtle surrender that came when fighting became more exhausting than peace. Belle's posture, her labored breathing, her withdrawal from everything that had previously brought her pleasure, all spoke of a horse who had reached the end of her strength. "She's telling us it's time," Martin said gently, his words confirming what the family already knew but hadn't been able to voice. "She's not comfortable anymore, and she's trusting us to make the decision she can't make for herself." Tom stepped forward, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he reached out to stroke Belle's neck. "How do we do this, Martin? How do we say goodbye to someone who's been part of our family for 28 years? "The same way we've loved her all these years," Martin replied, understanding that his role now extended far beyond medical procedure to encompass grief counseling and spiritual guidance. "With gentleness, with respect, and with the knowledge that ending her suffering is the last gift we can give her." Jake looked up from his position on the hay bale, his young face streaked with tears he wasn't trying to hide. "Will it hurt her?" "No, Jake. The injection works very quickly and very peacefully. She'll simply go to sleep and her pain will be over. It's the gentlest way possible for her to leave us." Sarah moved to Belle's side, running her hands along the mare's neck with the same gentle touch she'd learned as a child. "Where should we do this? Here in the paddock where she's always been happy, or should we move her somewhere else?" Martin looked around the familiar paddock, noting the apple tree where Belle had spent countless summer afternoons in the shade, the fence line where she'd greeted visitors for nearly 3 decades, the water trough that had refreshed her through thousands of Montana days. "I think here is perfect. This is home to her. This is where she's been loved." The family spent the next hour saying their private goodbyes, each taking time alone with Belle to share final words and memories that belonged to their individual relationships with her. Jake brought one last apple, holding it out with shaking hands before pressing his face against Belle's neck and whispering something only she could hear. Sarah stood quietly beside the mare, her hand resting on Belle's shoulder as she spoke in the low, gentle voice she'd used to comfort the horse through thunderstorms and veterinary visits over the years. Tom's goodbye was the hardest to witness. The stoic rancher finally allowing himself to show the depth of emotion he'd carried for the horse who'd been his daughter's companion, his grandchildren's teacher, and his own connection to happier times when his wife was alive and the family was whole. "Thank you, girl," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Thank you for everything you gave us. Thank you for taking care of our babies and keeping them safe. Thank you for being exactly who you were every single day." Martin prepared his equipment with the reverent care that such moments demanded, knowing that the next few minutes would require every ounce of professional skill and personal compassion. He'd developed over 5 decades of practice. The syringe represented both ending and mercy, both loss and love, both goodbye and the final act of a lifetime partnership built on trust and mutual devotion. The last apple Belle would ever taste came from Jake's trembling hands, a perfect red fruit from the tree that had shaded her through countless summer afternoons. She took it gently, her teeth working slowly through flesh that had lost its appeal, but accepting the gift because it came from someone she trusted. Jake's tears fell openly now as he watched her chew, knowing that this simple act of sharing food represented the end of a relationship that had defined much of his childhood and adolescence. "That's my good girl," he whispered, his voice breaking, on words that carried the weight of 17 years of shared secrets, childhood fears, and the kind of unconditional love that exists between a boy and his horse. "That's my Belle." Martin had positioned himself where he could work quickly and efficiently while remaining unobtrusive to the family's final moments with Belle. The injection site had been prepared with the same careful attention he'd given to thousands of medical procedures over his career, but never had his hands felt less steady or his heart more heavy with the responsibility of what came next. Sarah knelt beside Belle's head, her fingers stroking the soft area around the mare's eyes, with the gentle touch that had comforted the horse through storms, veterinary visits, and the ordinary stresses of a long life lived in partnership with humans. "You've been the best teacher, Belle," she said softly. "You taught my children to be gentle, to be patient, to understand that trust is something you earn and keep sacred. You taught me that love sometimes means making hard choices." Tom stood at Belle's shoulder, his weathered hand resting on her, neck in the same spot where he'd placed it 28 years earlier, when she'd first arrived as a young horse, full of promise and energy. The circle was closing now, the beginning and end of their partnership connected by decades of daily care, seasonal rhythms, and the accumulated weight of shared experiences that had transformed an animal into family. "Whenever you're ready, Martin," Tom said, his voice steady despite the tears that tracked down his weathered cheeks. "We know you'll take good care of her." Martin drew the pentobarbital into the syringe with movements made automatic by years of practice, but his mind was entirely focused on the gravity of what he was about to do. This wasn't just medical procedure, it was sacred ritual, the final act of a lifetime spent dedicated to preventing animal suffering and promoting welfare. The veterinary oath that had guided his career for 50 years reached its ultimate expression in this moment of ending pain through love. "Belle," he said quietly, his voice carrying the warmth and respect that had characterized their relationship since she was a young horse full of life and possibility. "You've been one of the finest horses I've ever known. It's been my privilege to care for you all these years." The injection went smoothly into Belle's jugular vein, the catheter Martin had placed, ensuring that the medication would work quickly and peacefully. Belle didn't flinch at the needle's insertion. She trusted these humans completely, had never had reason to fear their touch or doubt their intentions. That trust, Martin reflected, was both the greatest gift and heaviest responsibility of veterinary medicine. "It's working now," Martin said gently. "She'll become drowsy first, then lie down, and then she'll simply go to sleep." Belle's eyes began to soften within seconds, the pain and discomfort that had marked her final weeks gradually fading as the medication took effect. She swayed slightly on her feet, and Jake moved quickly to support her head as she began the graceful descent that would mark her transition from life to peace. "Easy, girl," Sarah whispered, as Belle's knees buckled and she settled onto the soft grass of the paddock she'd called home for 28 years. "Easy now. We're right here. With you." Belle's breathing slowed as her family surrounded her, each keeping a gentle hand on her body as she made her final journey. Tom stroked her neck, Sarah held her head, and Jake maintained contact with her shoulder, ensuring that the last thing Belle felt was the touch of people who had loved her without reservation. "She's gone," Martin said quietly, after checking for any sign of heartbeat or respiration. She went very peacefully, surrounded by everyone who loved her. The silence that followed was profound and sacred, broken only by the sound of wind moving through the apple tree that had witnessed so many of Belle's happy moments. Jake's sobs came from deep in his chest, the kind of grief that accompanies the loss of something irreplaceable. Sarah cried quietly, her tears falling onto Belle's mane as she continued stroking the horse, who had carried her family through decades of joy and sorrow. Tom stood slowly, his body showing every one of his 73 years as he looked down. at Belle's still form. "Thank you, Martin," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for taking such good care of her all these years, and for helping her leave us with dignity." Martin packed his equipment with hands that moved automatically through familiar motions, while his mind processed the weight of what had just occurred. Belle was gone, but the love that had surrounded her final moments would endure in the hearts of the family who had devoted themselves to her care. The apple she had taken from Jake's hands would be remembered as the last gift shared between them, a symbol of the trust and affection that had defined their relationship from beginning to end. The memorial stone sat beneath Belle's favorite apple tree, its simple granite surface bearing the inscription, "Faithful friend and teacher," along with the dates that marked her 28 years of life. 6 weeks had passed since that grey October morning when the Henderson family had said their final goodbye. 6 weeks during which they had slowly learned to navigate a world that felt fundamentally different without Belle's gentle presence. Martin stood beside the stone on this crisp December afternoon, his own recent treatment decisions weighing heavily on his mind. He had chosen a path similar to the one they'd chosen for Belle, comfort and dignity over aggressive intervention, quality of life over desperate measures to extend time. The parallel wasn't lost on him, and he found a strange peace in knowing that his approach to his own mortality had been informed by Belle's graceful example. The Henderson family had invited him to share lunch and visit Belle's grave, a monthly tradition they'd established to honor her memory and process their ongoing grief. Jake had returned from his first semester at Montana State University, where he was studying veterinary medicine, with the kind of passion that comes from understanding the profound responsibility of caring for animals and supporting the families. "Oh, do love them, Dr. Caldwell," Jake said as they walked together toward the memorial stone. "I wanted to thank you for something. The way you handled Belle's final day, it showed me what I want to do with my life. I want to help families the way you helped us." Martin felt a deep satisfaction in knowing that Belle's story would continue through Jake's chosen career, that the lessons learned in that paddock would influence how future animals and families navigated similar journeys. Belle would be proud of that decision, Jake. She always was a teacher. Sarah emerged from the farmhouse, carrying a thermos of coffee and wearing the kind of peaceful expression that comes from having processed grief and found meaning in loss. "Martin, I have news I wanted to share with you. We've decided to adopt a rescue horse, a 15-year-old mare named Ruby, who needs a quiet home for her retirement years." The decision represented everything Martin had hoped for the family. The understanding that loving Belle completely didn't end with her death, but could transform into love for another animal who needed care and companionship. "That's wonderful news, Sarah. Belle would approve of sharing her home with someone who needs it." Tom joined them by the memorial stone, his weathered face showing the kind of acceptance that comes from a lifetime of understanding that love and loss were inseparable, parts of the same experience. "Ruby arrives next week. The rescue organization says she's gentle and patient, good with children, different from Belle in many ways, but we're not looking for a replacement. We're looking for a new chapter." The wisdom in that distinction impressed Martin. Too many families tried to find exact replicas of beloved animals, setting themselves up for disappointment when new pets failed to match impossible expectations. The Hendersons understood that each animal was unique, deserving of love for their own qualities rather than their similarity to someone who'd come before. As they shared coffee and memories beside Belle's grave, Martin reflected on the phone conversation he'd had with his son David the previous week. The news of his father's cancer diagnosis had bridged years of careful distance, creating space for the kind of honest communication they'd avoided since David's decision to pursue computer programming instead of veterinary medicine. "Dad," David had said during their first real conversation in years, "I never understood why you were disappointed in my career choice. But hearing about your diagnosis, thinking about what you've devoted your life to, I get it now. You weren't just treating animals, you were helping families love better, grieve better, make impossible decisions with wisdom and compassion. The reconciliation had been another gift from Belle's story, Martin realized. His approach to his own mortality, informed by decades of guiding families through similar decisions, had shown his son the deeper meaning of veterinary medicine in ways that years of explanation had failed to communicate. "I've been thinking about retirement," Martin said, as they sat in comfortable silence by the memorial stone. "Not immediately, but soon. I want to spend whatever time I have left doing the things that matter most. You'll always be part of our family," Tom said firmly. "Belle's legacy includes the relationships you've built with all of us over the years. That doesn't end just because you're not our official veterinarian anymore." As the afternoon sun slanted through the bare branches of the apple tree, Martin thought about the cycles of life and death that had defined his career. Belle's story was ending, but it had created ripples that would continue long after her physical presence was gone. Jake's career choice, the family's decision to adopt Ruby, Martin's own reconciliation with David, all were part of Belle's ongoing influence on the world. The drive home took Martin past fields where he'd made thousands of farm calls over the decades, caring for animals and supporting families through the joys and sorrows that come with loving creatures whose lifespans are shorter than our own. Each farm held memories of births and deaths, triumphs and tragedies, the endless cycle of beginnings and endings that had given his work meaning beyond simple medical practice. Belle's memorial stone would weather many seasons in that peaceful paddock beneath the apple tree that had shaded her through countless summer afternoons. But her true monument was more enduring. The lessons about love, loss, and dignity that she'd taught everyone whose life she'd touched. In teaching them how to say goodbye with grace, Belle had shown them how to live with greater appreciation for the time they had with those they loved. Martin pulled into his driveway as darkness settled over the valley, grateful for the privilege of having participated in Belle's story and humbled by the wisdom he'd gained from watching a gentle horse face the end of life with trust and dignity. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions about his own future, but tonight he felt the peace that comes from understanding that love's greatest expression sometimes requires the courage to let go with grace.